Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a huge question, maybe the question. Why is Nigeria the way it is? We're going to dig into a powerful analysis that looks at the deep historical and structural roots of the nation's challenges to really get past the headlines and understand the underlying why.
So, let's kick things off with a puzzle, a pattern that just keeps repeating itself throughout Nigerian history. It seems almost hardwired into how the state responds when it's challenged in a certain way.
I mean, think back to Ken Saro-Wiwa, a world-famous writer and environmental activist, executed by the military regime back in '95, even with the whole world watching and protesting. And then, let's fast forward to today. You've got the case of Nnamdi Kanu, the separatist leader. He was captured abroad in a really controversial way and then sentenced to life in prison. Now, the analysis we're digging into today says, hold on, this isn't just a coincidence. It's not about who's in charge at the moment. No, it's a grim continuity, a pattern that's baked into the country's very design.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this argument, here's the game plan. We're going to look at this pattern of punishment, then trace it back to the colonial blueprint. We'll see how that created a mindset of an estate, not a nation, which leads to a hierarchy of lives, and finally we'll see why the structure is the point.
All right, first up, this pattern of punishment. We need to understand how the state decides who gets dealt with and how. And the key thing to grasp is that this isn't random, it's systemic.
So, to really see what's going on, you kind of got to look through three lenses at the same time. First, the very nature of the state itself, like who is it really built for? Second, you can't ignore the British architectural plans that are in many ways still standing. And third, all of this has created this really deep-seated culture where punishment is the go-to tool for control. Okay, let's rewind. To get a handle on Nigeria today, you absolutely have to go back to the very beginning, to its creation.
So, back in 1914, Nigeria wasn't born out of some grand unified dream of nationhood. Nope, it was basically an administrative decision by the British. The logic was all about financial and strategic control. They stitched the North and South together to make it easier to manage and, crucially, to use the revenue from the South to pay for running the North.
And here you go. This map shows you what that decision looked like on the ground. A single colonial territory with the borders we know today. But you have to remember, this wasn't a coming together of peoples. It was a fusion of territories, a purely geopolitical creation. And this really shows you the power dynamic right from the start. The whole thing was built from the top down. It was designed to serve the interests of the colonial power, not to build a nation of equal citizens from the ground up. So how did the British manage this huge, diverse place? Well, they used a strategy called indirect rule. What this meant, especially in the north, was they basically partnered with the existing rulers, the emirs. This gave that group a special status and built a power imbalance right into the foundation of the country, an imbalance that would stick around long after the British left.
So this whole colonial setup didn't just create a country on a map. It created a specific mindset, especially for those who would inherit the keys to the kingdom. And that mindset was this: Nigeria isn't so much a nation, it's property.
In this quote, man, it just perfectly captures that idea. Now, it's worth saying that historians debate whether these were his exact words, but honestly, that almost doesn't matter because the idea it represents is so powerful. This idea that Nigeria is an estate to be managed and controlled by a select group.
And when you start thinking of a country as your estate, it has some pretty brutal life-or-death consequences for anyone who challenges your ownership. And that brings us to the evidence of how the system treats people differently depending on who is doing the challenging.
Just look at this. The analysis points to a really stark contrast. You have guys like Dimka, Orkar, and Vatsa. They tried and failed with coup plots, and they were executed. They were seen as outsiders trying to break in. But then you have an insider, like Muhammadu Buhari, who was overthrown in '85. What happened to him? He was detained, sure, but he later came back to become president. It suggests a pretty clear hierarchy of who's expendable and who's not.
And look, this hierarchy, it's not just for soldiers. When Ken Saro-Wiwa's non-violent movement threatened the oil revenues, which, let's be honest, is the economic lifeblood of this estate, he and his colleagues were executed. Their challenge was treated like treason against the economic order.
And it's the same pattern with Nnamdi Kanu. His agitation didn't just threaten a policy, it challenged the very borders, the territorial integrity of the estate. And the state's response? Maximum force. We're talking about an extraordinary rendition, which is a fancy way of saying a state-sponsored abduction from another country, to frame his political movement as an existential threat that had to be neutralized.
Okay, so here's the big takeaway. If you really want to understand these events, you have to stop looking at just the individuals or blaming specific ethnic groups. You have to look at the underlying structure. The problem is systemic.
And this is why you hear the word restructuring over and over again. It's not just some political slogan. These are fundamental demands to redesign a state that many feel was never built to serve them. They're talking about genuine federalism, about local control over resources, and shifting power away from this super strong central government. In essence, they are trying to rewrite that original blueprint.
You know, we also can't ignore the role of external powers. A lot of Western strategic interests, from oil security to counterterrorism, are often better served by the existing centralized power structure, even if it produces internal injustice.
So, to truly get it, you have to follow these steps. See the colonial design for what it was, recognize the estate mentality it created, and shift the focus from blaming individuals to demanding deep, institutional reform. Ultimately, the state's harsh response to certain types of dissent isn't a malfunction. It's a feature, not a bug, of an architecture designed for control, where any fundamental challenge is seen as an existential threat to the owners of the estate. And that forces us to ask a much deeper question. It's not just, why did this happen, but rather, who built the system that makes these outcomes almost inevitable, and who continues to pay the price? The answer to that question, well, that might just hold the key to Nigeria's future.